I turned them all on. Did you turn them on?
I think so.
Okay. I'm just gonna make sure it's recording. Oh yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to give thanks to Tom for the prayer tonight, for opening us up in a good way, and to welcome you all to our first, well, we had an initial meeting. I'm going to try and move this up there. We had an initial meeting back in July of 2018, and so this is our second land code meeting, and we were supposed to have in September, and then it was deferred to today. But I wanted to first recognize our guests. We have Chief Kelly LaRocca here and Cassandra from the Land Advisory Board, and wanted to give a little timeline of our of the land code that's been discussed through in Hiawatha. So Council started discussing a land code in 2016, with a motion being made to prepare the application for the Lands Management Act in September of 2016. In February 2017, we passed Council passed an FNCR to commence developmental activities pursuant to a framework agreement. And then in April 2017, we signed the adhesion to the framework agreement. In September 2017, funding agreement with ISC and LAB was signed. February 2018, we hired our lands clerk, Kelly Dickinson. And then in 2018, again, was that initial presentation, and we put a call out for committee members. And then the land code was developed, the land code committee, sorry, was developed, and they started working on the land code. In 2018, Natural Resources Canada prepared a research report on existing information of the exterior reserve boundaries, and phase 1 of the ESA commenced. In 2019, the Land Code Development Committee developed first draft land code and community ratification process. And survey work has commenced for land description. And now we are into our meetings, with this being the first one after all that process was completed. And so I'm going to turn it over to, but I wanted to thank again, Kelly, Chief LaRocca, and Cassandra for being here, and they're going to provide an overview on the land management, their experiences on the process, and they'll be happy to answer any of your questions after their presentations. English.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm going to unwind.
Yeah.
I'm not moving off this on anybody. English, Chief.
Pani, bonjour. Najoi Makwakwe, Deshnakas. Waksashidodan, Chichakdodan, Scugog Island First. So, I mean, great to be here amongst my people of Hiawatha, my brothers and sisters. It's great to be here. I always feel very welcome in the Hiawatha community, and certainly I've grown up here in many ways, and I've learned things here in Hiawatha, particularly at your powwow. Tom, you'll recall, I had some lessons at your powwow. It was great. Thank you very much for always welcoming me. I want to find Aunt Terry. Aunt Terry, I'm stuck in your parking spot, so I'm going to stay the night at your place. Hope that's okay. I'm in. Anyway, so if anyone has kitty litter, let me know, because I'm stuck in the snow. I had a bit of a malfunction, but anyway, rental car, no snow tires. But I wanted to say thank you for dinner, thank you for the prayer, and again, thank you for hosting us from the Lands Advisory Board and Lands Advisory Resource Center. So you guys and gals all know me as a member of Scugog, as the chief there at Scugog, but I serve as an elected board of director on the Lands Advisory Board, and I proudly do that. Scugog itself has had a pretty proud tradition being part of the Lands Management Group for over 20 years. And so I feel like I'm kind of carrying on the footsteps of my Uncle Gary, to be honest. He was the chief back when Scugog took a step into the unknown, so to speak. Back then it was such a new thing, nobody had any kind of reference as to how it was actually going to play out at the community level. It was definitely, I'd say, a leap of faith for the communities that went ahead and forged into lands management. And so I just always have to tip my hat to those people, because it's kind of gutsy, really. They kind of dipped their toe in a water that could have been really hot or really cold. As it turned out, it worked very well for Scugog, and in fact, as well as for the other First Nations that took part as original signatories to the framework agreement. I want to say thank you to Chief Carr and to the council members from Hiawatha First Nation, as well as the elders, for welcoming me to your community. You know, I know that in all of our First Nations, as far as I can tell anyway, having been involved in lands management now, it's my second term, and having been serving on the council at Scugog for over 10 years now, it went by in a flash, wow. I feel like any First Nation I visited, man, we're all diverse, for sure. Each of us is unique, for sure, but we always have a lot of the same issues, for sure. I think we have more similarities than we do differences, particularly all of us in the Williams Treaties too. I feel that we're obviously culturally, linguistically connected and geographically connected. So when we look at lands management, it's nice to call upon the experiences of our sister communities and trying to figure out how we want to go forward as a community into what feels a little unnerving, right? You know, I've been to a number of communities, Chippewa communities. I went to Rama, Kettle, and Stony Point. You know, I've seen and heard a lot of the different concerns and considerations, and each First Nation has different land compilations of how we use the land. So some First Nations have more CP land than others, some have very little, some have locatees, some have a lot of business on reserve, others have very little. So it's a really mixed bag, but at the same time, the end goal, the end game of lands management for each of our communities is the same, which in my view is self-government. So self-government scares the bejeezers out of us on some level, because again, we don't know what that means. In terms of the framework agreement for lands management, it means self-government over your own territory. So if you think of, you know, when I talk about Scugog, I always say, oh, band number 34, put a marker around an artificial border around the reserve and create a pie. So that is, you know, the area or the territory which we have self-government over as per the framework agreement for lands management. So hopefully that makes it a little clearer. It's that pie. It doesn't yet include traditional territories, for example, or extend beyond the reserve boundary. So I'm just gonna kind of flick as I go. Some slides I'll belabor the point, other slides I'll kind of gloss over. But today's presentation, and I just want to note, if you ever would like me to come back, if you don't, I understand too, but if you do, I'm putting it out there now that I'm happy to come back and just, you know, do the same thing again for more people, or go over some Q&A or whatever you guys need. I love doing this work. It's part of what I do, and I'm happy to do it. So this presentation, I'm going to talk about sort of the historic significance of lands management. Some people will know it really, really well. Other people maybe not so much. Maybe it's the first time you've heard of it or haven't had much experience to talk about it or look at it. So we're going to start from ground zero, and I can come back and do that as many times as you need. I'm going to talk about the purpose of the framework agreement and the implementation of control or self-government over our reserve lands and resources. And then I'll talk a bit about Scugog and what our experiences were under that land code. And then at the end, I'll do a Q&A. And I think Cassandra has a presentation following me. So I'll try not to talk too much, but I love to ramble. And probably your council and elders know that already. Aboriginal First Nations. So we've got a map here of all kinds of different First Nations all across Canada. We're obviously Indigenous, the first peoples of the land. we are self-governing. We have been self-governing since time immemorial, or as far back as we can recall, or as time allows. And we have time immemorial occupation of Canada from coast to coast. So without a doubt, self-governance for our people has been the primary topic of importance for our people since settler societies came, certainly, but even before that. You know, we just did a presentation on strategic planning at Scugog. What a boring, dry topic. But I was saying to our people, we've been strategically planning for millennia. Like, really, if you think about it, it sounds like such a Western or non-Indigenous topic to strategically plan. But our people were strategically planning. If you think about the Williams treaties, we were, as I love to refer to this book I read, one of our experts said, we were strategically sedentary, always. We knew when to deal with other tribes and when not to. We knew where to go and when we had to go there, and what to harvest and what not to harvest. And so that is strategic planning. So I really think that strategic plan evidence of our people having done that, is really evidence of our self-governing authority. This is not a new concept. It's something we've been doing for millennia. So, you know, we rely often on the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is something we hang our hats on. We hang our hats on that in the sense that we have to find things in law that are cognizable to settler societies. Well, the UN Declaration is one of those examples, and it is the highest and best articulation of that inherent right to self-govern that we all share. So sure, we'll hang our hat on that, but we don't need some silly UN declaration telling us that we are self-governing people. We've been strategically planning for millennia. So this whole lands management thing is, in my view, and I don't know, some people might disagree with me, but I feel like it's incremental, sort of piecemeal self-government. It doesn't apply to the traditional or the treaty territories over which we were strategically planning, over which we were strategically sedentary. But it applies again to that pie, that reserve land that we love and live on. And so, darn it, let's at least take that away from INAC. That's how I feel. I know it, again, it's a scary concept because our communities have disagreements, right? I often think our identity as Indigenous peoples, our identity as Indigenous communities is born out of the disagreements as much as it is the agreements, which sounds kind of weird, but it's true. And it's not avoidable. And no matter who's going through self-governance or trying to go through that mire, or that it's like wading through wet cement on some level, no matter who's doing that, you're going to find disagreement. That's just natural. It's harder on us because we are in that bordered community. So we feel it, right? It's our friends, it's our neighbors, it's our families. And so it makes it that much more difficult. But darn it, it's that much more difficult because Indian Affairs has made it that way. The federal government has made it that way. And so what I love about the land code is it kind of forces us to deal with conflict in a way that is good, that is born from us as Indigenous people, as Anishinaabe. And I really feel that that's what it's done for Scugog, and I'll get into that later in the presentation. So, you know, we've, since settler societies have come over here, we have negotiated various treaties and policies with the federal government, or the federal crown, I should say. And those policies and treaties, from their perspective, were negotiated as a way to administratively deal with the Indians, right? That was the top-down relationship that was not envisioned by the Royal Proclamation, that was not envisioned by the Treaty of Niagara, gosh no. But the Crown, that relationship with the Crown evolved into one of top-down authority, where they thought, oh, we have to efficiently and in a cost-efficient way deal with the Indians. So that's what they did through the negotiation of treaties in an effort to settle Canada, and in particular for us, Ontario. You know, one of our experts in the Williams Treaty said, we settled Ontario as a way to expedite the proliferation of sports fisheries, Right? So we're quite familiar with what that means, that top-down heavy authority. And that's really what's happening to us every day in our reserve boundaries. So I see lands management as a window, or in this case, really a doorway for Scugog anyway, since for the last 20 years, into something better that we can control as a community. Because even though it might be kind of easier, maybe on some level, to push a decision off to the minister, it's not in the end, because A, we'll never get what we want, B, it'll never be as quickly as we need it, and C, it will never reflect who we are as Anishinaabe. So if we have those peaceful disagreements within our community figured out, that's how we're going to get what we need as a community. Next slide. So everybody knows Sir John A. Macdonald, none of us like him. You'll recall that he admitted that the great aim of the Indian Act was to do away with our own tribal systems of government and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the rest of the colonized population. So none of us like him. We know what he tried to do. We know the feds are still trying to do it. I don't mean to be conspiracy theorist. You know, I'm glad that the Liberals finally woke up in the previous election and at least put us back on the agenda, which, you know, heck, we were never there for so many years. But still, they're not doing nearly enough, as we know. And, you know, it's just really a continuation of this in a nicer format. Next slide. So the legacy of the Indian Act. We know it's paternalistic, right? The great white father of the crown knows best, right? And I hate to use that word white. I don't use that word very flippantly because I think it sounds kind of reductionist. It sounds a bit maybe even rude, but you know, that's really what paternalism means, that somebody else knows best, father knows best. And so the Indian Act keeps us under its thumb. You know, we all remember the former iterations of the Indian Act required that we needed permission to leave the res, permission to sell hay. I mean, hay, for heaven's sakes. But that was a commodity. That came out of Mother Earth, and darn it, the Crown wanted use of that. They wanted to know where all the hay was going and how much less in treaty annuity money it could pay us, which is crazy. We know that the Indian Act helped or create a political colonial framework to allow for the proliferation of residential schools. It used to allow for enfranchisement. It forbade us from forming political organizations or even hiring lawyers. It prevented us from pursuing land claims. It prevented potlatch and other cultural ceremony, and it denied us the right to vote. So we all, you know, we've all heard bits and pieces of that. Maybe some of you are probably very familiar with that. The Indian Act, we could go on forever. I could do one talk on the Indian Act alone, but I won't. So anyway, next slide. Good old Constitution. Section 25. So nothing in the Constitution shall be construed as to basically abrogate or derogate or take away from any Aboriginal treaty or other right and freedom that pertains to the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including rights and freedoms recognized by the Royal Proclamation or rights and freedoms that now exist by way of land claims agreements or so may be acquired. What all that means, if you enter into lands management and you have treaty rights such as the Williams treaties, right? We just got through all that negotiation business. None of that's going to affect our constitutional rights. Our constitutional rights are what they are. Our treaty rights are what they are. They will be there forever as the grass is growing and the river is flowing. But we can enter into lands management, and that will not take away or change those two other sets of rights negotiated by way of treaty and as provided for under the Constitution. Next slide. Section 35. So most of us probably heard about this, but I'm going to yammer on for a sec. It says Section 35 is really speaking to that box of rights that Indigenous peoples of Canada, or Aboriginal peoples of Canada, I should say, hold under the Constitution. It says the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. Well, darn it, that one section, that one subsection is what was a thorn in our sides for so long when we were still in the throes of negotiation for the Williams treaties, because we weren't recognized and affirmed. Our treaty rights were sort of out there. They were claimed. We knew we had them. We exercised them for over 100 years. Well, at least since 1923, I should say, we exercise them. But, at the same time, this is saying, unless they're recognized and affirmed, they don't exist. Which I find kind of disgusting, of course, from a legal perspective, right? Because I put my lawyer hat on and I'm like, that's really sneaky. But anyway, at the same time, now we're good to go. Why? Because Canada and Ontario, thank you very much, have finally saw fit to recognize our constitutional rights that exist under the Williams Treaties. So now they are recognized and affirmed. Subsection 2, Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes Indian, Inuit, and Métis people. I always point that out. It's just so interesting from a definitional point of view that it still uses that word Indian. So that's what keeps us under the constitutional thumb or framework, and it reconfirms the Indian Act and all of the definitions that come under that as to who a citizen is. So unfortunately, it assumes that definition of Indian, and of course Inuit, North of 60, and Métis people. In subsection 1, treaty rights includes rights that now exist by way of land claim agreements or may be so acquired, i.e. the Williams Treaties again. The Aboriginal and treaty rights referred to in subsection 1 are guaranteed equally to male and female persons. So of course they care about equality of application of the law. Next section. So that will all still apply, even though if and when you do enter into lands management and get your land code passed. Alrighty, so this slide speaks to sections 53 and 60, the delegated authority section under the Indian Act. I understand Hiawatha was section 60. You had delegated.
Yes.
53, 60, and then kind of repeats itself here, mind the slide. And then it speaks to the framework agreement. So I'm going to touch on these various things. Basically, the framework agreement began because some First Nations had increasingly disheartened or had become increasingly disheartened with the process of delegated authority, the 5360 provisions. I can go over a separate slide at the end of this to talk about, Indian Act delegated authority versus lands management. I'll go over all through that, and then we can always get it distributed to your community as well. Because, we think delegated authority is good. It gives us a little more exercising of control, but not really all of it. And it still doesn't meet our needs to respond to things in a way that reflects our cultural tradition, our Anishinaabe-ness, I always like to say, and it doesn't respond in a quick way. Anyway, I'll get into that later. But basically, First Nations found that 5360 delegated authority basically still required that the minister would allow certain things. And it came with strings attached, I guess is the way to put it, and insufficient revenues to cover activities that needed to be carried out. So it was woefully underfunded. So First Nations were taking on delegated authority over certain sections, certain activities under the Indian Act. However, there was never enough money to satisfy those. Those communities noted that the department, or what used to be called DIAN, and now it's INAC, or now it's CERNA, or who knows what it is, but it changes every 5 minutes. Basically, even DIAN, we'll use that, the old school reference, even they couldn't afford to carry out the things that were delegated to the First Nations under the maximum budgets that were potentially allowable to the communities. So even DIAN or INAC couldn't afford to do that. So how on earth could it expect that a First Nation with delegated authority would actually succeed in doing what it sought out to do? Because there was never enough funding to do it. It was like a setup for failure situation, which of course we're familiar with from DIAN. Basically, some of the 5360 communities, there were issues that the First Nation brought forward during the department's Lands, Reserve, and Trust review of the Indian Act in the late 80s, early 90s. In the end, the authority and the resources provided, again, were not sufficient to carry out the work that was needed. And basically, First Nations often ended back funding or augmenting 5360 funding. And it ended up helping DIAN in the end. And again, I'll get into the chart on the differences between those two. So I'm going to step aside from that 5360 issue for a moment. And I'm just going to talk a bit about the framework agreement. Basically, the framework agreement, well, let me back up. The First Nations Lands Management Act, we all kind of refer to it with that in that way, and sometimes I even do, which is wrong. The board would slap my hand for that, because really it's the framework agreement that gives all of us our I want to say authority, because we have that inherently, but that's what outlines our rights, basically, according to Lands Management, is that framework agreement, not the actual First Nations Lands Management Act. What that act does is it basically enables, in Canadian law, the federal government to enter into the framework agreement with the First Nations. So that really is all that the Lands Management Act is about. The framework agreement itself is what is most historically significant, and is where all of the rights come out of, basically. It outlines the relationship. So that agreement was, I'd say, quite a historic event between the communities. It was signed in Georgina on February 12th, 96, by the 13 original First Nations, and I think there was a 14th there quickly thereafter. And in order for Canada, again, in order for them to ratify that framework agreement, Canada insisted that at least 2 communities had to have ratified their own land codes in order for the whole process to go ahead. So Scugog Island just so happened, little old Scugog, small but mighty, little old Scugog and Georgina Island were the first 2 communities to ratify their land codes in 1997. Georgina Island to this day will say it was the first. I will respectfully disagree, but anyway, it was a bit of a race. It's a sore spot. It's a sore spot. Anyway, Bill McHugh likes to tease me. And I think Muscadet First Nation followed shortly after. So I think, right, Canada ratified the framework agreement by passing the First Nations Lands Management Act in 1999. So that's what it had to do to ratify that agreement. It had to pass the First Nations Lands Management Act. So again, the framework agreement is where it's at. And here I have the existence of the act is only to provide for the ratification and bringing into effect of that framework agreement on First Nations Lands Management. So basically, what is the framework agreement? It was the first real recognition that First Nations have the inherent right to govern their reserve lands and resources. Of course, we already know that. It's no big news to us, so we don't really see this as, on some level, as earth-shattering. But from the government's perspective, that was the first real recognition of inherent right, which I feel does way more than the sort of, if you think of from a political standpoint, the inherent rights policy of INAC. It's kind of full of platitudes and not real substance. To actually acknowledge it through a self-government agreement, I think has a lot more teeth, if you will, or meaning than an inherent rights policy of INAC. So through its land code, a framework agreement First Nation is unconditionally recognized with all the rights, the powers, and the privileges of an owner of its lands, community held owner. I don't even like that word, really. I think bands with inherent rights, no, we are stewards of land, we don't own them. And that's basically with the exception of the ability to sell. So just so you know that. Just as an aside here, let's see where it is. There's Gary Edgar. I always point him out, sorry. I think Bill McHugh's up there talking. And Rob Louie, he should be in there somewhere, I think. Maybe he's talking. No, that's Bill McHugh. Anyway, you'll meet Rob someday, I'm sure. He's the chair of the Lands Management Advisory Board and former chief of West Bank, very successful, but very culturally inclined gentleman, and he's someone I have a lot of respect for. So hopefully you guys get to meet him one day. So next slide. My slides are different from your slides. We're playing catch up, that's okay. Right. So again, purpose of the framework agreement, to enable First Nations to resume control over their lands and resources for the use and benefit of their members without government interference by replacing the land provisions of the Indian Act with First Nation made laws. That's really, that sums it up right there. What does it mean? We all have, if you guys want to go forward with lands management, when I say guys, I mean guys and gals, I'm speaking figuratively. So if you want to go forward with lands management, you have to pass a land code. That land code is basically kind of like your constitution, or Chinaknagewan, right? I'm probably butchering the Anishinaabe pronunciation of that, but that is your, that is the constitution of who you are as a community, as a collective. What I really like about lands management is it connects everything to land. And I know that sounds simplistic, but that's the argument that we always put forward as First Nations. When we go to court, when we are arguing about the Williams treaties, when we are in court arguing about any number of things, language, cultural rights, children, child welfare, we're always bringing it back to the land. We are intimately connected with land, and if we don't have land, our cultural continuity gets broken, right? That I've heard tell at many child welfare conferences, many conferences with elders, many conferences on language, culture. If we don't have land, we have nothing. We lose the ability to describe land, to interact with land. By fishing with your kid, that's how you pass on your culture, right? We know this. It seems so simple, really, but that is what we're putting forward in court. Just thinking from a lawyer perspective for a minute, that's always what we are about, is the land is where it's central. That's where we are from. So land first, people second, kind of, right? We are born from that land. If you look at our creation stories, that's where they all come from, is land first. So I think that's why I like lands management, because it's the people in your bordered community who will look at those bordered lands and make decisions about how you live on them. Really, it allows a community to ask itself, what are our priorities? How do we want to use land? How do we go forward in meeting our goals? What is the strategy towards meeting them over a period of time? Because you can't possibly be expected to enter into lands management and then poof, you're like, you know, Cinderella. You don't turn into a fancy princess and have all your legal framework laid out. The messy stuff comes. It's hard work. When you enter into lands management, if you think of the reserve, again, as a pie, there's a piece of pie that's missing. There's a piece of pie missing now. If you think of provincial legislation, we as First Nations are always saying, provincial legislation doesn't apply here, right? Well, we know the Highway Traffic Act does, and quasi-criminal offenses. Certainly federal law does, but provincial law does not. So it leaves the job up to First Nations on some level to fill or occupy that field. So in First Nations lands management, that is the key to occupying that field in the way you want. If you want an environmental law, you can do that, or not. It's up to the community. If you want to control dogs, that's what Scugog did. You notice when you come to Scugog, we don't have any dogs running around anymore. We used to. We control dogs through a dog law. And we figured out ways to do that in a respectful way that is inherent to the way we are as Anishinaabe. Right? We're not going around bagging dogs and dropping them off at the farm, right? Like, there was a way we handled that as a community. We are handling trespass right now, nuisance, maybe even banishment, which is something that we never want to talk about. And you don't have to do that. It is up to you as a community. That's what I like about lands management. It allows for all of us to get together, have those conversations, do the hard work, have the tough conversations, and then get it done, make a decision. It really gives you freedom because you're not waiting on some minister up in Ottawa who you'll never see and never hear about, or his bureaucrats, or hers, as the case may be, and to rubber stamp whatever it is bylaw you want to make. And that's what you still have to do under 5360. You still have to worry about getting ministerial approvals. So your delegated authority is delegated to a point. So it doesn't give you freedom. within your space. True freedom would be renegotiating the Constitution, quite frankly, of Canada. And I don't think we see that coming anytime soon. I wish to heck it will be there. I hope it's in my lifetime, and I hope I'm at that table, but not going to happen anytime soon. That's why this right now is good for us, because at least within the land we share, right? We share it together, good, bad, and the ugly, right? We are families, friends, neighbors, co-workers. People out there don't care about each other in this room in the way we do, right? So it's about deciding that for yourselves as a community and deciding what not to do, right? I think that's really key too. In lands management, you go at the pace as a community that you want. You don't have to pass all these things right away. You don't have to feel like you're in a rush. If you want to do nothing, which is a strategy, our people have known it well. If you want to do nothing and not go there or here or there and harvest here or harvest there or set up camp here, you sit back. That's a strategy. You know, that when they say Indian time, that's a strategy, right? That's somebody else is imputing something negative to that. Indian time is our time. That's a strategy. So I refuse to look at it in a way that is negative. It's actually ours. Lands management makes our land our own. And it's only us who are going to make laws concerning land that actually reflect how we want to guide a community with social policy. How do we want to create better management of where our teens hang out? Something simple like that. Do we want to allow four-wheelers to go all over the place? We almost had a near miss. I mean, it was terrifying in my community with four-wheelers and crazy noise, like noise and nuisance, lack of safety. Our kids were out all hours. Now we're looking at creating a space so that they have their space, but it's safe, it's maintained, it's at certain times, right? It's not disrupting young families who are trying to get their kids to bed, or older people who don't want to be bothered by the noise of such things. So that's partly what lands management does. It doesn't sound too sexy or exciting, but it actually creates for a more peaceable community, because it allows space in a friendly way to get together and deal with, you know, these questions of how we're going to live together. Because Lord knows, Diane or INAC or whatever they're called, they don't care. They want us to be in friction. Okay, sorry, I'm going off on a 16. That's 16. Anyway, I'm just going to follow mine because I think we're a little off. We're a little off sync, so I'm going to leave that there. So as of October 2019, there were 163 signatories to the framework agreement. 91 First Nations ratified their land codes and were operational. 56 First Nations are in development of their land codes. And 3 of those First Nations that were operational have moved on to other self-government agreements or treaty agreements. So that's really huge. What does that tell you? It's number one, I think it tells us it's working. It's been 20 years since lands management has been in effect. And so now we have proven evidence of very diverse communities across Canada that lands management is actually working for our communities. It's creating better health outcomes, better education, better economic development. Why? Because if you can get a business going in your community for your band, that will augment all the crappy Indian Affairs money that they give us that is a pittance. So we can afford to pay people good wages. We can afford to put money where we want it, creating that social policy that we know exists as Anishinaabe. So you want to educate your kids, bankroll that education funding. You want to care for your elders, get some assisted living programs going on, keep them home. So that is, I think, where lands management is excellent, because for Scugog, it has given us marked improvement in education and health outcomes. Bang on. We have addictions programs. We have addictions issues like any community, right? But we have addictions programs that we are we are funding in a way that Indian Affairs would never dream of doing that. It would help us too much. And it's helping. Family group counseling, confidential, off reserve. Nobody's seeing who's going in the health building, right? It's allowing people the space to heal. So that's the way I feel about lands management as well. It actually has far-reaching impacts that are beyond the black and white text of a land code. This is about, again, us deciding our collective futures and how we want to direct monies to create social policy for our communities that makes sense for our communities within that bordered space. Where am I here? Okay, next slide. That's what I was talking about before. So that's the 163 framework agreement signatory communities. And, you know, I think that's huge. There is so much interest being expressed. At this time, Indian Affairs, okay, let me back up. Who we deal with at the federal level for lands management related funding is way different than, you know, just Carolyn Bennett and her close friends. There's a separate division of people that we are dealing with for lands management related funding that are receptive, and they're actually helpful, dare I say. I think because if we were really gonna get down to it, we're helping them solve problems that they can't solve. It's us helping them on some level. Us being self-sufficient, us helping each other, us providing our own means for economic development is only going to help them in the long run. Does it mean they're going to take away funding? No. They've said as such. That's all you can go on is what you have, what information you have. That's the information we have. And so I think that that's why they are wanting this to help communities, because they know, are they going to get in there and actually resolve all these boil water advisories? They don't have the money to give out that they want to. I'm sure it's somewhere. I know there's a trust for Indigenous communities that exists that is rightfully all of ours, right, as Indigenous communities across Canada, but and they're probably living fatly off the interest. But at the same time, the reality is they're not going to help us in the way that we deserve and in the ways that we actually need. And so it's about us figuring out ways, thinking outside the box as a community. I bet your education outcomes are awesome. You guys have elders here. I see you in the crowd. That kind of collective knowledge is so powerful, and it deserves to be harnessed. That's another thing about lands management. You can create things like an elders council and actually fund it. Actually put your resources towards it. Have them be a separate, what we call them was a committee of sober second thought. direct questions to that space, because you need that help to govern yourselves as a community. And so, gosh, I look out here and I'm like, as at Scugog, we have very few language speakers left. Again, social policy, you can direct money towards that if Indian Affairs doesn't see fit to help our languages proliferate. Okay, I'm going off on a tangent. So some of the main principles of the framework agreement include input and approval by all on and off reserve voting age members. So 18 plus members, on or off reserve, you get a say in your land code, and you will be asked to approve it or not. First Nations lands continue to be lands reserved for Indians within the meaning of Section 91(24) of the Constitution Act 1867. What does that mean? Well, there's that pesky constitutional piece that I wish we could renegotiate, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. What that means is, back in 1867, the feds and the provinces were horse trading. They sat at a table and went, "Hey, well, what are you going to have jurisdiction over?" Well, well, the feds are sitting there going, "Well, the Crown's saying, well, we treated with these folks. I mean, I guess we'll take on Indians and lands reserved for Indians because it's our bag. We We have these agreements, we owe them fiduciary duties, so we're gonna take that on. We'll call that section 91. And then the provinces said, all right, well, section 92 will be everything else. So they sat there and went, okay, well, what about, the administration of justice or healthcare or education? So that's how basically these areas of jurisdiction got divided up. But what I love about lands management is within your space, within your reserve, you will have that power to govern yourselves, unlike has been the case prior. The First Nation has lawmaking powers over lands and resources, so you can do, again, you can do environmental laws. We're just starting to do that at Scugog. Just a note, that's 20 years. 20 years in the making, and now we're just getting to our environmental laws. Like, I'm not going to paint a picture that's all, sunshine, rainbows. It's hard work, but that's okay. We have a lot of laws that we have passed, which we will share with you gladly. Some might apply, some might not. Some you might look at and go, we're not interested. But some you might love. Reality is, again, a community will do what it needs to do on its own time. And that's okay. The special relationship with the Crown is retained, so that honor of the Crown is still required. Legal status and capacity is more clearly defined, so we are self-governing over our reserved territories. No expropriation of reserved lands by government. Hallelujah. So now they can't just come in and take out a big swath of land and decide that they want to put a railway through it, which they can according to the Indian Act. Protects and maintains treaty rights and or Aboriginal rights under the Constitution, which I went through that previous slide. Canada continues to be liable for previous acts and omissions. So, for example, the settlement of land claims. So, we just settled the Williams Treaties, but we were asked as part of that Williams Treaties process to let our lawyers know if we, as communities, could conceivably make claims for other areas according to the expert evidence that had been obtained through the Williams Treaties process. And so, we don't know if they're provable per se, but a lot of us as chiefs, councils, elders committees, and certainly the Williams Treaties experts have pointed the communities to certain directions. Oh, you might want to look at this area, you might want to look at that. It may amount to nothing, but you may have a claim there. If you enter into lands management, it's not going to forego the community from pursuing other land claims. Third-party interests on reserve are protected until the interests have expired. So, for example, if you have a lease that's 25 years or whatever, and it extends beyond the life of when your land code is passed, that lease will continue to be law. It provides for certainty of law, so you can't really go back and change something that had already been entered into, so to speak. Land codes will require a level, some kind of mechanism for conflicts of interest to be called out, to be identified and dealt with, basically. Sorry, I'm struggling for the word. Having a baby brain moment. I have 2 young kids. And of course, matrimonial real property laws be developed by the community. And our Lands Advisory Resource Center is extremely helpful in coming to your community, working with you. They'll do community meetings, meet with your council, meet with your community or your elders, whoever, about how you address issues concerning matrimonial real property. Basically, a huge amount of support is provided through the Lands Advisory Board. On the one hand, there's the through the Resource Center, I should say. On the one hand, there's the Lands Advisory Board. So that's what I almost called him Chief. I am so used to calling Robert Chief. Robert Louis, former Chief of West Bank, he is the chair. There he is there. And so he's the chair of the Lands Advisory Board section. They deal with mostly, we deal with representing each of the regions across Canada who have land code communities. And it's like an advisory function, but it's also a bit of a lobbying or advocacy board where if things need to be dealt with at the federal level, that board will take those issues forward. And basically it's made up of chiefs who are elected to represent. So I've been elected for the East region, for example. On the First Nations Lands Management Resource Center side, Chief Austin Bear, Chief of Muscadet, he is currently the chair of that Resource Center, which is incorporated as well and exists separately and apart from the Lands Advisory Board, because it has all the staff are under this side mostly of the Lands Resource Center. So people like Cassandra and Heather are coming out to assist and support communities that are going through the whole land code process. So they're more like technical support, and the advisory board is advisory. And just keep going here. And there's a huge amount of sharing that takes place when you think about all those 163 communities that we showed you on that big map. All those communities have various laws they've drafted. Some are very different. We have mechanisms to report them in what we call the First Nations Gazette so that they are made public. But you know, there's a lot of sharing that happens between the communities. So the communities actually end up supporting each other in a very large degree. And I think that that adds a lot of power to you as a lands board community. You know, First Nations can share a lot of things, but if you're within the same regulatory framework of lands management, you have a commonality and a context that makes it more easy to share laws and actually use them in a meaningful way. Next slide. So I could talk about Scugog forever, of course, and most of you already know about my little community. Small but mighty. Basically, you guys know us already, but I'm going to just say quickly, we are, if you think about it, we're a figure 8. If you think of Scugog Island, it's really a peninsula. It's not an island. It used to be an island. It's not anymore. So our reserve is a figure 8 at the northernmost point of the island. It's landlocked. It has a regional road that bifurcates it in the middle of the 8. So that's kind of, the casino is kind of the middle of that figure 8. And we have lost, we have one language speaker left. She lives in a home off the reserve. It's very sad and quite scary. We're in a bit of a cultural crisis. So I'm admittedly looking at the crowd and I'm thinking, oh, I see a lot of elders I can ask for help. So that's good. I might be calling on you. As part of the Williams Treaties process, we're obviously looking at land, so we purchase other lands that are contiguous to the reserve or beside the reserve, trying to think about how we can buy land that's going to help us do development, quite frankly, without upsetting our neighbors. So we're trying to, it's a bit of a monopoly game, and I know all the Williams Treaties communities are involved in that. But again, entering into this land code process will not affect any of your land acquisition strategies or ATR strategies that have resulted as a result of the Williams Treaties. You know, it's really, I have to admit, lands management, as a kid, I didn't have a clue what it meant and probably didn't much care because of course I was a kid who was selfish, you know, but then I grew up and I realized that Scugog, we didn't administer our own education. So our education was through INAC, and then eventually it was through the Mississaugas of the New Credit, because INAC decided it was going to be through them, which I found very odd. It didn't really make sense, but okay. Specifically now as a council member, I'm kind of like, why would New Credit take that on? Well, it's because INAC thought it was administratively easy. So I, as a student, went through New Credit to try and access education money, which you'd think, you know, back then Scugog was so tiny. When we moved out there, there were 14 houses and I think 25 members in total. And we were told, according to the Ogimawatch Tribal Council, our tribal council we use, we were told, according to a study, that by 2031 there'd be none of us left at Scugog. And so we were in a member or citizen crisis, really, a community crisis. We didn't know whether we would continue past then. And then the land code was passed, and it was passed to allow for the Great Blue Heron to be born, basically. We, Chief Gary Edgar and the council back in the day, saw an opportunity through the Ray government, good old Bob Ray, NDP as he then was, and they were putting out for First Nations inclusion and economic development around gaming. So they saw a bid through them, and as you know, the Great Blue Herons there, that has been really the lifeblood of our community. But none of that would have happened had we not signed a land code. So to me, I guess that's kind of why we have a historical connection to lands management, because it's really created a lifeline for the community. Without gaming in our community, we couldn't have taken education on and away from New Credit and directed that social policy of education on our own. Now we have, oh gosh, we just had another PhD graduate, she's 70, amazing. And we have really awesome education rates for post-sec and for secondary. Like it's gone up tenfold probably. I could probably get you some stats that are updated, but it's like night and day. I was the only kid going to university back then, and I even had a hard time accessing funding through New Credit because it was attached to their list. So I kind of got bumped to the end of the list. When we took on lands management of the casino going, our council backfunded education, which really helped me go to school. So, you know, I feel I owe a great deal to this whole process in some level. But really, I think what's cool about it is we've done a land use plan. We're doing a strategic plan. We are having meetings as a community about, again, nuisance, trespass, the tough issues. I mean, they're ugly issues, right? But it's, I don't want to say forced us, because I think we kind of, it crept along when we were ready, right? If you have so many stumbles in a road as a council, you kind of know, okay, the members are ready now. You have a sense of when people have said, enough, we have to deal with this issue now, right? And so you gently bring it forward, and if the community isn't ready, they'll tell you. And then maybe you shelve it, like our strategic plan. It was shelved for a while. Now it's back. People are all gung-ho. It's all good. So we've adopted, you kind of get a real pulse for how the communities, when they're ready for something, when they're not. And if they're not, they're not. And that's the beauty of lands management. Again, you can come at an issue and then back away if you need to. Or you can deal with things quickly. We were having issues concerning drug dealers in the community. Our land code acted as our constitution, so the courts would help us enforce that. The removal of drug dealers in the community. We had to act fairly quickly to remove someone. Police, local police services, you guys have Hiawatha police, I think, so that's even better. But our local police service with the region helped us, you know, enable that BCR to deal with that person. And, you know, that's, again, as a result of lands management. If you have the Indian Act, I don't think we could have done that. Certainly Curve Lake had a situation where it could, it's not a land management community, and they tried to banish, or sorry, evict some drug dealers, known drug dealers from the community, and it wasn't successful. So, you know, what the court's saying, well, you don't have a constitution. So if you have a land code, you have a constitution of sorts. So that's very helpful from a legal perspective. And the concept of enforcement, I would say, if I, you know, because people ask me all the time, well, what's the best part about lands management? And then they ask me, what's the worst part about lands management, right? Because again, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. So I would say the enforcement piece is sometimes the more frustrating, because courts are literally, after 20 years, courts are literally just now becoming alive to, hey, wait a minute, there's this whole other source of law out there that exists within our small town Ontario First Nations, for example, in Ontario, but really across Canada. And what are we going to do about their inherent right to govern themselves and their inherent lawmaking authority? How are we going to help this process? And so you're seeing there's case law out there that is starting to adopt and promote the enforcement of First Nations laws, which is awesome. It certainly helps the band govern itself within that territory. But what I most like about lands management, I'd have to say, is that before it gets to that stage, before you even have to test it at the court level, you can create things in your laws that are Anishinaabe. So for example, we're doing a banishment law at Scugog right now, and we've promoted a process that's community driven. that requires a circle, that requires a meeting with an elder, a bit of mediation at the start, or low-level conflict resolution. And then if it progresses beyond that point, you go to the community at large and require people to talk and answer to certain things and behaviors and issues in the community. And sometimes that's going to fail, and sometimes it's not. And you can avoid a lot of messiness. So I feel really strongly about that. Maybe it's my legal side coming out, and I'm a bit of a law geek, but I feel that that's the strength of lands management, because again, we need law that reflects ourselves. If you think about the Canadian constitutional system, all Canadian law is born out of Britain. And all British law originally was born out of the church, right? Because like, who's that guy that cut off all his wife's heads? Henry VIII, thank you. So, you know, he really wanted a divorce, right? So he's like, oh, I can't get a divorce. The church isn't going to legally allow me to do it. I better cut their heads off. So he ended up chopping off all his wife's heads because he just found that was easier. It was easier that they legally die, which he could decree as the king. And then he could go about his business and, you know, find a new wife. That was easy for him. Then what was, you know, figured out was, hey, you know, we need to separate church from state, because you know, we can't go killing, you know, cutting off people's heads all the time. And we need to have a separation of church and state. So that's really that, if you think about that all the way back then, that is where the church formally broke off, supposedly, from all law in Britain. And then, oh, well, then we just have this happy state law that has no religious connotation whatsoever. Yeah, right. It was born out of church canonical law. So all that state law that carried on all those years was then brought over here. And that's what exists in Canada. That's where our constitutional framework comes from. So really, our constitutional framework is British, but it's also religious, right? Born out of the Church of England. So that is quite troubling when you think of it. So what's better? Well, at least for us living in these communities that we know and that we love, let's do it ourselves rather than rely on silly customs and traditions that really aren't our own. You know, so what's the point of all that? Lawmaking in lands management communities is very far-reaching. People just think it's only about land. No, it can be about business licensing too. We're doing a business licensing law in Scugog that is a law formally recognized under our land code, or Chinoknagewin if you want to look at it in a different term. So that is hugely important. It's a doorway to economic development. It will create cultural revitalization, it will create health, and it will create healing if that is the way the community wants it to go. Because if you create a doorway for economic development for your community, I mean, I drove here, I was like, wow, I'm always amazed by the beauty of your lake. And I'm a little jealous because we don't have one, right? So I'm just gonna come here and stare at yours, or I'll stay at the auntie's house. And but, you know, I look out there and think, wow, you could have any amount of tourism or not, but that's yours to do, and to do it in a way that is responsible to your Anishinaabe roots. That's very exciting. You guys have such opportunity here. I feel it's a doorway for economic development that would be, I mean, different, but just as good as Scugog's or any number of the lands management communities that have signed on to this process. So I think we'll change the slide. Oh yeah, I mean, a couple of slides there talk about all the different dev and everything that Scugog's done. You all have the presentation, so feel free and read that or ask me about it. You know, I think that it's really important to note that Scugog has 230 members. Gaming happened in our community. People wanted to move home. Our community proliferated, which blew my mind. I mean, we used to think, well, how can we get our youth to meet Anishinaabes? Like, are we going to have community dances at Curve Lake or, but they've proliferating at home, and it's amazing. And they are running the community now. It's amazing. Our young people are, man, they're promising. So right now, we've just, it's not on the slide deck, but we've created an economic development corporation that exists separately from the council. I mean, we still have an arm into it or a site into it because, Dev Corp can't open a mine on the community, like that would be ridiculous. But, there are certain rules around, again, the use of our reserve lands and what we hold dear. But that corp is going to go out off the reserve and seek all kinds of opportunity for us. Again, I feel that it's an extension of signing that land code. Everything was born from that moment for Scugog. And if you talk to the other lands management communities outside of the Williams treaties, they're going to tell you much the same story. Opaskwayak Cree Nation, oh man, they are unreal. West Bank, of course, Dakota Whitecap. I mean, there's 100 stories out there, or more obviously. I really encourage you to get to know those other communities. Cassandra and I will hook you up with that information. But sorry to drone on. Thank you for listening. I'm going to sign off now, but I'll be back for Q&A after a break. And Cassandra, if you call a break, people need to use the bathroom probably. Or I don't advocate smoking, but for those of you who need to. Me bless you guys.
Five-minute break? Okay, when you're taking a 5-minute break.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Hey everybody, sorry. I'm going to introduce Cassandra from the Lands Advisory Resource Center. But before she comes on, I'm going to take a little more space and just say, here's a list, a comparative chart between First Nations lands management or sectoral self-government authorities versus delegated authority or 5360 under the Indian Act, which is what Hiawatha has done previously. So I think that instead of me droning on and going over the list, we'll make sure that it gets handed out to your community so you can see that compare and contrast chart, and that will help you kind of understand, okay, well, this is where we're at now under the Indian Act versus where we could be under lands management. So just throw that out there. And here's Cassandra.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. As Chief LaRocca mentioned, my name is Cassandra Godot. So I work for the Resource Center, and my role is technical support to all First Nations who are either interested in developing a land code, are developing a land code, or actually are implementing their land code. Kelly and Wanda asked me today if I could just talk a little bit about your land code and what's in your land code. So I'll kind of fly through that so I don't keep everybody here really late. I know it's getting late for everyone, so I'll just jump right into it. So I'm going to talk about the land code, and basically the intent of the land code itself is to be general. So you won't find a lot of specific details in the land code itself. It's supposed to be the basic land law of the nation, and from there you develop your specific land laws that are important to your community. So some of the things that Chief LaRocca was mentioning about business licensing or dog bylaws, or dog laws rather, those kinds of things are where we have meetings like this and kind of talk to each other and figure out what's important to the citizens here, what makes sense to develop, so that we're not just creating arbitrary laws for no purpose. The land code, it's also important to remember that it's a living, breathing document. So as we develop this, it's really important for all members to get involved and to share your input, because it is a document of the community. Nobody else tells you what has to be in this, so it doesn't come from Canada. They're not involved whatsoever in telling your community what needs to be in it or anything. And even when your community is ready to vote on the land code, it doesn't mean that it's set in stone forever. If there's changes that you see in 10 years that you think, gee, it would really make a lot of sense if we updated this section, then that's something that your community can do, and many other communities have gone ahead and done that. So I'll just kind of fly through the preamble. It's just the opening statement of your land code. It just explains, it's a very simple kind of one pager about where First Nation land management comes from, when your community got into deciding whether you wanted to be part of the framework agreement, and just explains the purpose of having a land code. Part 1 of your land code talks about preliminary matters. So it goes over all the definitions that you'll see throughout the land code. So anytime you see a word that's capitalized in the land code, you can always go back and check the definition section, and you'll find it there. It also includes a section that talks about the interpretation, so that no matter who's reading the land code, it can be understood in the same way by everyone. And there are a few important clauses in there, and we just noted 2 of them here, is that the land code will be interpreted or read or understood in accordance with your language, your culture, your traditions, and your customs. And it doesn't affect any Aboriginal treaty or inherent rights or freedoms now or in the future. It also talks about, sorry, next slide, the authority to govern and where that comes from. So it describes how Hiawatha's collective rights and responsibilities flow from the creator to the people, and from the people to the council. So the land code is really laid out in a way where the community is the voice. The community are the decision makers, and then you give that direction to council to carry forward. It includes a description of lands as well. So many communities have never been provided an accurate description of what the external boundaries of the reserve actually are. So this process of going through developing your land code has actually prompted Canada to take a look at all the records they have on file, and they prepare what's called a research report. From that, they figure out if any survey work is needed, and some survey work is needed for Hiawatha, and some of the flooded area along Rice Lake. So that work is being done now. And then once that's completed, Natural Resources Canada puts together what's known as a land description report, and then that comes back to the community to be reviewed and approved. And it doesn't mean that those are the lands that are set in stone forever. It just means for the purposes of administering your land code and implementing that those are the lands that you'll be governing. So those lands can always be added to. Next slide. Part 2 of your land code talks about lawmaking powers. what kinds of land-related laws can be made. So generally, all of your laws can be made for the development, conservation, protection, management, use, and possession of your lands. It's very general sounding, but really it's like that because there is a lot of freedom in what your community can decide to do with it. It also lays out the lawmaking procedure. So it is very much a community process. So laws can be proposed at a council meeting, provided to all Hiawatha citizens and the lands committee. And there's a provision for emergency laws, say if some sort of environmental concern popped up, there's a process for that. Next slide. It also mentions the publication of land laws. So if you want people to follow your laws, regardless whether they're your own community or maybe outside folks coming to your community, you want them to be able to know what your laws are, so they need to be published. So it does mention where they need to be published at the admin office, in the council meeting minutes where it's enacted, and on your website. And for enforcement, it talks about what you're able to do. And it's really up to each community to decide how you want to enforce your laws, what kind of mechanisms you want, what kind of agreements you want to have in place. So you'll have the ability to establish offenses that are punishable on summary conviction, if that's necessary, if you view that that's needed here. You could provide for fines, imprisonment, restitution, community service. You could establish procedures and land laws for that enforcement. And you could retain a prosecutor or appoint a justice of the peace, or enter into an agreement with Ontario for a provincial prosecutor. So these are all options. It's not saying that this is exactly what you're going to do. It's just saying this is open to Hiawatha to decide when the time comes. Next slide. So this one's a pretty important section of the land code, and in my opinion, I think the most important, the community meetings and approvals section. So the land code really is guided by the community, and every Hiawatha citizen has the right to participate in meetings, and every eligible voter, so anybody 18 or older, has the right to vote on any matter that's being decided relating to limits. It lays out the process for community meetings, when community meetings have to be held, what kind of topics need to come to the community, and a procedure for how those meetings are notified to the citizens. Next slide. The land code also talks about when community approval is absolutely required. So council is able to add to this list if there's other things that come up along the way, but this is just the basics that have to come to the community for approval. So any master land use plan that your community works on will need to come to the citizens for a vote. Any interest or license that lasts longer than 35 years. Any non-renewable natural resource use that's longer than 5 years. Any deletion of a heritage site from that land use plan. Any voluntary exchange of land. And as I mentioned, any other laws or matters that council decides or feels needs to come to the community for approval. And I might just toss out there at the moment that the land code is just in a draft form. So if there's things that you feel need to be added or taken away from in the land code, now's the time to start taking a look at that and making sure that you send those comments into the lands department or the lands committee or the council, and make sure that they have eyes on that so that we can make sure that that's included. So the part 3 of the land code also talks about how you'll get community approval. So you can either have polling locations of like a very official vote setup, You could have just a community meeting and a show of hands to decide on matters. You could have mail-in ballots or phone or electronic voting. It really is the new age development a lot of communities are trying lately, and seems to be really great at getting members involved, whether on or off reserve. And so basically in the land code right now, it just says any matter that goes to the community for approval requires at minimum 50% plus one of those who vote can decide on that matter. So for example, oh sorry, this is about the ratification vote. So any changes to the land code itself also needs to come back to the community for approval. Since it's a community that's going to decide on the land code in the first place and vote on it, it's only appropriate that that comes back to the membership, to the citizens for approval if changes are needed in the future. Currently right now it says for quorum that at least 20% of all eligible voters must register to vote, and then 50% plus one of those who vote can decide on the matter. Part 4 of the land code talks about expropriation. So Hiawatha will have the ability to expropriate, but only after a good faith effort is made to try to reach a mutual agreement. And a true expropriation is extremely rare. And often communities just include this in their land code because all sovereign nations, all other levels of government have this authority. And under the Indian Act currently, First Nations are the only ones that have no ability to expropriate lands, but lands can be expropriated from us. So that's one thing that has been included in the land code, and it's up to your community to decide exactly how that needs to roll out. But before anything like that could happen, it does have to come to the membership to decide on what kind of law needs to be developed for that, and it would need to be approved by the community as a whole first. Next slide talks about voluntary land exchange. So I only know of one community across Canada who's ever done a land exchange. And basically, this would be in a situation where as a community, you decide that there's a parcel of your lands that you'd like to trade with some other level of government. Say it's another First Nation, say it's the province, say it's the federal government. So there is a provision in your land code in there, but I do just want to say it's very important that the framework agreement and your land code are very clear that your land base, the amount of land that you have, can never diminish. So say if you were to vote on the land code tomorrow and say it was passed, if you started out with 1,000 acres, you could never have less than 1,000 acres ever again. Say if you added, in 10 years, you added another 1,000 acres to your land base, you could never have less than 2,000 acres. So the land code really does protect your reserve land base for the future, and it can never be taken away from you. Next slide. Part 5 is also another pretty important section that deals with conflict of interest, financial management, and reporting. So there is rules in the land code that deal with conflict of interest that applies to council, employees, committee members, and the dispute resolution panel. And I'll talk a little bit more about the dispute resolution panel in a minute. Financial management. So any existing financial management policies you have can be developed or updated to include specific clauses that address the lands and natural resources funding that you'll have. And then the annual report. This is another very important piece that ties the community back to the land in an important way. where Hiawatha will no longer be reporting to Canada. Hiawatha will be reporting to the citizens of Hiawatha. Instead of completing reports quarterly or annually, that'll be done to the membership through an annual general meeting and through a report that goes out to all the membership. Part 6 talks about land staff and the lands committee. So council can delegate administrative authority to the staff to carry out day-to-day activities. And then the lands committee will be established to take on a whole list of responsibilities, but basically their role will be to liaise between the community and council, oversee community meetings, community approvals, make sure that the community is involved in all lands matters that are coming up. They're there to assist, advise, and recommend, do all the work on land laws that the community feels are necessary or needed. And that's pretty much the gist of the committee. Part 7 talks about revenue and the separate, or the First Nations land register. So basically, if Hiawatha decided to, you'd be able to set fees and rent for interests and licenses in your land. And then instead of those payments potentially going to Canada, those would instead directly come to Hiawatha. So some communities that have, say, a lot of leasing have experienced that those payments are made to Canada, or sometimes are never made to Canada. During my time working for Scugog First Nation, there was a number of lessees who had negotiated their lease with Canada, but Scugog was never at the table to negotiate those leases, so they weren't there to be able to set what terms they felt were important. They weren't able to set the fees or rates that they thought were appropriate or fair for their lands. And those lessees weren't even paying the rent, and Canada never followed up on it. So one thing that they were able to do once they passed the land code was to go after those lessees and say, if you're not going to pay our rent, we're going to issue a lease to somebody else who will pay the rent. There will also be clauses in there that talk about setting your own standards and criteria and forms for interests and licenses. So say if somebody has an interest in the land and they want to will that to their children, you'll be able to do that here in-house rather than going outside to Canada to process that. Next slide. So existing interests, they continue as normal. So for folks that have certificates of possession or location tickets, those things all continue as normal. There's absolutely zero change to any of those. With anything that does have an expiration date, that would have to come back to Hiawatha to renegotiate when that time comes. It lays out the process for granting new interests to citizens, such as CPs or citizen allocations, leases, permits, easements, blah, blah, blah. And it lays out just a general process for that. The land code is also very clear that no non-citizen of Hiawatha is able to hold a permanent interest in your lands. So in other words, you can only those folks who are a citizen of Hiawatha can ever hold a permanent interest here. These lands are set aside for your community, for your use and your benefit. So the land code just very clearly states that. So it can't be confused. Certificates of interest, so any CPs that were previously issued, they continue as normal. And allocation of land to citizens, that just kind of repeats what I was mentioning. Transfer of interests, so citizens can freely transfer your interest without any sort of council approval. So it's just written in there for clarity, so everybody's on the same page. Mortgages and seizures, there is a section that talks about that. Citizens will be able to mortgage your interest, so your CP, your lease, with council's written approval. And it does mention just 4 sections there of the Indian Act that continue to apply. And these are important just to note because they deal with Section 29 deals with lands can't be seized under legal process, so your lands can never diminish in size. Section 87 deals with lands and property that is tax exempt, so that continues. 89.1 continues as well, saying only Hiawatha citizens can have a mortgage or charge on real or personal property on reserve. 89.1.1, where leases can also be subject to mortgage or charge. And 89.2, where the seller of a chattel, so a movable item, say such as a trailer, that's sold to a Hiawatha citizen or to Hiawatha itself that's on reserve, has the rights agreed to in that agreement. It does continue and talk a little bit more about mortgages and seizures. So if a lease mortgage defaults, it can only be possessed by that chargee or mortgagee, so for example the bank. If it had written approval from council, if it was registered in the FNLRS, which is the First Nation Land Registry, it's just an online registry that keeps a copy of all transactions that happen on your lands, including mortgages, transfers, CPs, leases, all that stuff. And as long as a reasonable opportunity was given to council on behalf of Hiawatha to redeem it first. Wills and estates, that section of the Indian Act continues to apply. There has been some discussion about perhaps looking to try and take that on sometime in the future, but as it stands right now, that stays with Canada. For matrimonial real property, currently the Family Homes on Reserves and Matrimonial Rights or Interests Act, otherwise known as FRMERA, applies to all First Nations that don't have an MRP law. And MRP is matrimonial real property. So if and when Hiawatha decides to develop your own that respects your community, your way of doing things, you'll be exempt from that federally imposed law. Part 8 talks about dispute resolution. So rather than relying on outside systems, your land code provides for the ability to address conflict or issues here in the community before just jumping to court. So citizens and non-citizens have access to the dispute resolution process in the land code. It first actually goes through facilitated discussion, then mediation, then negotiation, and then final arbitration by the dispute resolution panel. And the roster panel is composed of a maximum of 15 panelists, and they're appointed to represent the various elements of your community. This panel can't act with bias or favor to any party in the dispute. Disputes will be heard by 3 of those people on that 15-person roster panel. And they have the power to hear the dispute and make a final decision. And that decision is binding and subject to review by the federal courts. And they may obtain the service of professionals to resolve those issues. Part 9 talks about liability. So it's just a very basic clause in there that just talks about council ensuring that there's liability insurance coverage for all officers and employees to indemnify them against personal liability. It talks about the offenses. So the offenses for summary conviction procedures of Part 27 of the Criminal Code will apply to offenses under the Land Code unless you create some other procedure. And no ratification vote is required for revisions to the Land Code if it's an amendment to your land description, if it's a wrong or expired clause referencing, if it's grammar or other typographic error, or minor improvement to language without changing what it's actually saying. And then finally, the last piece is the commencement. The Land Code and individual agreement, which we haven't really chatted about yet, only takes effect if the community approves it. So the next steps are to continue drafting the Land Code, to make sure that the community is involved in this and that your input is included in the Land Code through community meetings, or if you share your comments directly through the lands team or the lands committee. And then once there's a happy final draft at the end, there needs to be a legal review to make sure that it's legally sound. And then there's an independent verifier that reviews your land code to make sure it has all the necessary pieces that need to be in there. Also negotiating the individual agreement. So that's the other big document that we haven't chatted much about, but your community will also vote on. So the land code is your law. And then the individual agreement is the agreement between Hiawatha and Canada that actually transfers all the governance of your lands from Canada back to citizens of Hiawatha. It deals with the land description that I mentioned earlier. It deals with a phase 1 environmental site assessment. So work was done over the spring and summer to identify what environmental concerns there might be on your lands. And it addresses how much funding Hiawatha will receive. For communication, a big part of this process is making sure citizens are obviously involved. So locating citizens and getting updated contact information, and informing all eligible voters, youth, elders, all members. And then finally the vote. So when the land code's ready, sending out vote packages, notices of vote. And voting options will include online voting, telephone voting, mail-in ballots, and in-person polling stations. So that pretty much wraps it up, Miigwech. And I think we're going to turn it over to questions now. So if anybody has any burning questions, fire away.
For clarification, the two terms, interest and license. Interest is really CP holdings, and license is leasing.
So in your land code, it's pretty general. So sorry, I'll just repeat the question. What is the difference between interest and licenses, and what are they?
Our interest on par with CP holdings is just a different term, the same thing, and it's licensing leasing.
Okay, so the question is, are CPs on par with interests? Are they the same thing? And is licenses the same thing or on par with leasing? So yes, an interest, or the term interest, includes a certificate of possession. It also includes a right or a state of any nature in or to that land. It includes a certificate of entitlement. It includes a lease, an easement, right of way, servitude, profit of prondra, but doesn't include title to that land. So it's a very general term that you guys can further define later when you feel that's necessary. And then a license is more so just the right of use or occupation of that land. So license doesn't refer to lease. Lease is captured under the definition of an interest. Does that answer the question?
When you get around this negotiating the individual agreement, Chief LaRocca, you'd know, I suppose, what's the general bias from the government itself in favor for or against these types of things? Are they putting up roadblocks? Are they helping us?
As far as going into lands management,
Yeah.
I think there's real receptivity. Really, to be honest, I don't feel they're pushing. I don't feel they're pushing towards an agenda. They want this to be utterly and completely voluntary by the communities. If they were really pushing it, I'd be kind of like, I don't feel they're roadblocking either. In fact, the funding packages are quite healthy and better than what we're receiving in other bands of work. But I feel that they're actually supportive if the community wants it. I think the government, for now, has learned that it's really ill-advised to try and push us into, you know what I mean? So yeah, I'd say, I know that sounds not very helpful maybe, but I'd say they're quite receptive to this process so long as they get the community support for it, right? They don't want to ram it down anyone's throat.
So what would be the benefits to them?
I think the benefits to them is less sort of knocking on the minister's door for various approvals. I also think it allows for the government to say, look at that community, look how well it's doing. They're standing on their own 2 feet, doing their own economic development at their own time and then on their own timeline. We're not, look at that community, so successful. We're not, we've helped them become self-sufficient. So they're going to try and take credit for your success. Certainly they've tried to do that to us and many other lands communities I've seen, but really it's the community doing it for themselves. So while they might try and use it as a feather in their cap, I don't see it as that way. I think it takes real guts and guile for a community, again, to step into the unknown. I call it the unknown. I think it's just change now. I think we know we have market outcomes from lands management communities. If you take a look at, I think we did a Deloitte study, or KPMG, sorry, on the outcomes from lands management communities. They're very good. So I think it's been proven now over 20 years. Data is there to show that those communities are doing well. And again, it's not easy. Nothing worth it is ever easy, I guess. But it's darn sight better than knocking on the minister's door for something that never comes. When I think about even the simplest of things, well, certainly the casino never would have happened at Scugog if we were waiting on them. They would never want that to occur. And we wouldn't have had our ministerial approval. But if you think about, I know that we're talking lands management, we're not talking about elections. But my first election was appealed back in 2008. I served the whole term and they never got back to anybody, right? So, hey, hopefully it was good, but it turned out it was okay. But, the community thought so. But it was rather unnerving, right? That's the thing. It's up to the minister, really. And it usually doesn't go well. Any others? Sorry. Yes.
How long has the land code been around? That was one of my questions. And out of 600 and some
First Nations in Canada, there's only 163 that signed up for in that, I don't know how many years. And is our CP, is that going to change? I heard that certificate possession it will always stay that way.
So,
and is this an informative meeting or a consultation meeting?
well, this is definitely an information session. So it's not something someone's taking a box for consultation. Like, we're here to present facts around First Nations lands management. We don't come with an agenda. We're here to present facts about the communities that have signed on and what their experiences have been and what the actual land code, fallout of the land code is and what that means. But, you know, if Hiawatha isn't ready, then it isn't ready, right? CPs don't change. If we could, Cal, I don't know, do you have the slide up with the map and the stats on those different communities? So basically, since 1999, the first, I think, well, first 3 signatories, first 14 land codes were passed in
The first 3 were on January 1st, 2000.
2000, right? So I need that slide again. My facts are all jumbled in my mind.
Look one more.
Yeah, it's that one. That one. I need my presentation again, actually. Well,
Yes. So just to talk quickly while Kelly grabs her presentation there. In Ontario, this is actually the list of all First Nations who have ratified their land code. And you'll notice the dates along there. It's not all in order, I guess you could say. There hasn't been any set agenda of when First Nations vote on a land code, work on a land code. So it's really been at the pace of each community, and each community takes the time that feels appropriate for them to develop a land code.
So, right. As of 2019, there are 163 signatories to the framework agreement. 91 First Nations have ratified their land codes and are operational. So that's 91 communities we can look at as examples of what's happening and how it's going. 56 First Nations are in development of their land codes, and 3 of those First Nations have moved on to other treaty or other self-government agreements, because again, we mentioned sectoral or you know, sort of an implemented piecemeal approach to self-government or the reserved lands only. So that doesn't mean that self-government stops there. You can keep negotiating that forward. Sorry, I don't think I answered all your questions, Georgine. I'll just wait on yours quickly. I just want to make sure I've addressed everything.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's okay.
But I guess the other question, where does all this funding come from?
Defense.
Yeah, the funding comes from the feds.
Defense. It's another federal funding framework.
Where we get our funding from?
It's still the federal government. It's a separate, different federal funding framework that frankly is a lot more healthy than what we receive under the Indian Act. So if you just look at it from a bare dollars and cents perspective, it is a better package. And it opens doors to, I think they know this, it opens doors to making the band's coffers bigger, right? Because it allows for greater efficacy of economic development for the band, for the collective.
The other question was, in Scugog, is all those programs that you put up that they have funded by the federal government or from your casino?
So we still negotiate federal funding agreements for all of those programs, and they take on, like INAC still funds us separately from First Nations lands management funding. We still get funding for health and education and all those typical programs that we have as First Nations. So that funding is in addition.
From the casino? Yeah.
No, sorry, in addition from the feds. So there are 2 separate pots. We still get all the INAC funding that we typically would under health and education, all those things. Then there's the lands-related funding for lands management. And then in addition to those two pieces, there's the third piece from our own selves, right, that we augment those programs.
It just seemed like you got all these services from the land code.
Scugog has really, when we tell the story of Scugog, it's really the genesis of all those programs that we have up there on the board, we attribute to the land code. That's how our community has really seen it, because without being able to go forward in economic development in the way we did, none of that would be up there, you know? So as a community, we really, that's how we see it. You know, some would argue with us. I think there are people out there that don't like lands management. They see it as, oh yeah, well, that's just another federal framework, right? Yep, it is a different type of agreement, but it's an agreement we've willingly entered into on a government-to-government basis, not top-heavy for the Indian Act. Go ahead. Sorry, Georgina.
Just to follow up on John's question and the clarification, 163 framework agreements in Canada, and how many have land codes now?
Sorry, guys. 163 signatories to the framework agreement. 91 First Nations have ratified their land codes.
Of those 163?
Yes. Yes.
630 plus First Nations.
Yes.
And in Ontario, 19 have land codes of 131 First Nations, and how many have signed in Ontario?
That's one number I didn't calculate before
Yeah.
I came.
We can get you that number.
Yeah, I'll get that number for
And
sure.
in regards to funding, I know there's a big pot of money right now. I'm gonna say push of the federal government on the land code. That's how I interpret it. But it's short term, it's not long term. Eventually, Hiawatha will have to find ways through levies and other sources internally to fund that lands program, or fund leasing, or fund transfers to that land management position. That's my understanding. Comment on that? Where does the funding come from long term? Administration.
Yeah, I mean, like INAC money, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. I think Forrest Gump said that. You know, the feds, it is a federal funding package, right? So if you just look at the logical extension of that, or the theory around that, anything's possible, right? But the Indian Affairs money that you negotiate is a pittance compared to lands management, firstly. Secondly, you don't lose the band support funding with regard to programs such as health, all that stuff. Thirdly, sorry, Georgia, I'm just going to try and finish. So thirdly, then you have the lands-related funding. There has been zero indication that that's going to stop. There has been zero taking back of what's been offered from year to year. In other words, it increases. And they are negotiated, I believe, on a 5-year cycle. I'm just going to confirm that with the lab board, but I'm pretty sure that's what they negotiate in that, for the lands funding. So what Georgina's saying is, you know, there's a lands officer you're probably going to want to hire, maybe an admin assistant, right? And then you're going to keep your own lands registry. So if you become a land code community, you would take on the creation and administration of your own lands registry with all basically keeping a record of every surveyed piece of land or unsurveyed piece of land in your community. And believe me, that is a task and a half, but man, is it worth it. Because now you're not having to go and search out in some crazy archive, you know, CPs that, I mean, you're gonna have to search them out anyway at the first instance, but then you have it done and it's here in your community. And that's power, because you have that information at your fingertips, which Scugog has definitely benefited from in its development. But, and then what else would you need with the lands? I'm just trying to think. So yeah, sorry, is there other pots to that lands funding you're referencing, Virginia?
Well, the lands money comes from section 5360 designation since 1990
For Hiawatha, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our CPs are intact as far as I know. So those are all exist, they're not in our lives anymore. But if land code comes in, all of those CPs still have the same.
Force and effect?
Yeah, prior to the land code, but they all go into that land record. And then who's going to administer them and how. Long term.
Sorry, I hope the mic's catching this conversation. I'm trying to, it's just tough. There's a bit of background noise. And so Georgina, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So what's been discussed is basically, there's your CPs are what they are. That won't change. So what does it matter if you have your own land registry system? Is that?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay, sorry. If we could just keep it sentence by
I'm
sentence
just
and I'll
saying
repeat it.
right now through section 260, all these things done by the land officer. There's no fee to the individual landholder, the local fee that holds the lease. There's no fee for individual landholders that have CPs to transfer those or to do anything with their lands. The land manager does it all through section 5360.
There's no fees under lands management either. Okay.
Yeah, there's the ability to put levies and fees and charges.
If the community wants that. Yeah.
Won't be called taxes, but it can be imposed.
See, the beauty of the land code is you can do that if you want, but if you don't want to do it as a community, you don't. So there doesn't have to be any of that. That's not a requirement. That is something that the community can exercise the option to do. So it's not an automatic requirement. There's no fees like that. I think it's important that we talk to our families, our friends, our neighbors about it, because we want to make sure the right accurate info is out there on that it's not going to give this blanket right for your council and to issue all these taxes and fees, right? If you don't want it to, you can put in your land code that it can, right? That's the beauty of the land code. You can pass it as a community or not with what you want to provide. No, that would be your community. Your community has to ratify that code, right? So when you get a draft going, that's when it really gets interesting, because then you can go over sort of line by line. What does this mean? What does this mean for renters? What does this mean for people who hold licenses to do certain activities on lands? What does this mean for lessees? What does this mean for CP holders? All those questions will come out. You can have a line by line on your land code and ask that of each section, each question, because nothing creates better transparency than that. And I have to say, you as members can demand that transparency. Now, I know you're as council, we all do our best as chiefs and councils to be transparent, and that's what we do. That's part of why we're there in that seat. But the land code, which your council is facilitating, will allow for your community to demand a level of transparency. That's what I like about it at Scugog. Certainly, I just wanted to note too, a couple of things when you were speaking, Cassandra. I noted Scugog's actually updating our land code right now. I don't know, for those of you who haven't been out to Scugog in a while, we don't have clean drinking water. We've been on a boil water advisory since, well, really on and off since 1992, but permanent drinking water advisory, so no drinking of the water since 2008. And, our community really struggled. When I started on council in 2008, I was a young kid, didn't know anything. I went in there and I was like, why don't we have clean water? Let's get this done. We have a casino, for God's sake. And the council said to me, Kelly, whoa, we understand what you're saying, but INAC owes us a fiduciary duty. So let's make sure that they contribute. We're going to pay a lot of this for sure, but let's make sure that they contribute too. So we're taking time to get our ducks in a row, do all the planning that they require in accordance with their facility policy, and get some cash out of them. Let's make them contribute in accordance with their fiduciary duty. So we did, and we, hammered down their doors for a few years. It seemed like forever, but we got some funding out of them, which was awesome. And now we just built a water tower, and it's going to be open in the spring. It'll be operational. But why do I tell that? in the creation of that water plant, we realized, uh-oh, the council can't expropriate land in accordance with our land code. So then we thought, oh no, so what does that mean? To lay a pipe across CP land means we'd have to pay for the privilege of supplying clean water to the community. We'd have to pay a CP holder for that. Oh no, members aren't gonna like that. So what did we do? We went out to the community. We said, okay, what do you want to do about this? And people said, well, what's reasonable? So that's really the question you answer as a community every time something happens under your land code. What's reasonable? And generally people come to a middle ground. And what was reasonable for us was, okay, let's allow for expropriation only in the instance of service provision. So just this much to lay a pipe, well, maybe it's this much, but to lay a pipe to get clean water to everybody without having to pay for that. Or, well, in lieu of a payment for that specific laying of the pipe, but it's minimal because we didn't want to have to be held over a barrel, I guess is the term, on having to pay to provide services to the collective. So that's how we did it. And right now we're looking at the revision of our land code to allow for that. The CP owners, what do they say? It's reasonable. So that was good. I was really proud that that came out that way. I think in Cassandra's presentation, she mentioned as an example that would require community consensus is a master land use plan. So in our updated land code, we are making sure to just kind of tweak some things. We want to define, what does a master land use plan mean? Are there smaller land use plans? Are there servant land use plans? Anyway, so that's what we want to make clear as a community, that we all know what kind of land use plan we're talking about, right? What's the extent of that usage? And then again, the deletion of heritage sites. What does it mean? Like, that wasn't ever spelled out super clear in Scugog's land code. So we're just trying to, again, create a process where we talk about what is a heritage site, and how do we define that as a community, and what happens if we come upon one that becomes archaeologically significant in our development or whatever. So we're ironing out those processes. And yeah, so I think it's a healthy exercise, and we haven't done it for 20 years. So it's time for us. Georgina?
I'm sorry, I'm taking the time, but so if you don't like part of what's in the draft land code, and only one citizen, how does that get taken out? Because page 23, section 20.2, A and G talk about establishing fees, funds, charges, and levies, and all lands including CP. So to me, that's what I'm asking. Also, how many sections of the Indian Act is the land going in place? Because there's two varying items. One says 44 sections of the Indian Act in place by the land code, and another says approximately 30. I'm not sure.
I believe it's 44 is the accurate number. We could get you guys a list of those sections and send them out.
Yeah,
Maybe that's something right.
they're on that website.
Are they? They're on the lab.
And of all of the land code First Nations, the interest was to know how many are CP, how many have a lot of CP versus standalone.
Those communities have a ton of CP land. I'll tell you that. I mean, honestly, from what I've learned, being on the Lands Advisory Board, you can pretty much do a comparison, and usually a community will have anywhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of its communal land base taken up with CP holdings. And so that is, kind of a typical happenstance of history that has occurred in our First Nations, clear across the board. So I don't think that has left people to shy away from land code implementation, so far as I can tell. Certainly in Scugog, it's 1/3 of our land base.
Just thanking you for this. But finally, I mentioned always because Hiawatha was considering station from Chief Kelly LaRocca, it would be nice to have the two sides coming here to talk about pros and cons, benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sure.
One, that brings
I was
up
just gonna
one thing that she's,
I was just
Oh,
gonna
sorry.
repeat the question, Georgina, just for the videotape and everything. Georgina asked that, or suggested that we bring in as a guest, the Georgina Island Cottagers Association to come in and speak about pros and cons regarding land code, because Georgina understands that they've been impacted. So, you know, certainly more information is better than not.
well, it comes up with the appraisals too, right? We get the 5-year appraisals done and Indian Affairs has been covering that. So once that's not in place anymore, it's their, how's it going to get paid? So my assumption would be the landowner, right? They may have to pay, but I don't know. So I think that's a good
I think it's a good suggestion.
suggestion. Yeah.
And, you know, I know Bill McHugh, he's been, like Georgina Island was one of the original communities too. And Bill McHugh loves to go out and do these types of meetings too. I think he'd be a really good resource for you guys too. To come in and talk about their experiences, because he's certainly been through the gamut, formerly as chief and now as a counselor. He's on the lands advisory board too, so he could probably bring that association forward. And it's a good suggestion. Okay. But certainly if anybody has any questions that they think of after tonight's presentation, please feel free and email both Cassandra and myself, and we'll definitely get some answers for you. And anything we can't, we'll figure it out.
I'll just pass it back to Chief LaRocca.
Thank you, ladies, and thank you for everyone coming out tonight. We greatly appreciate your time and your questions and hearing the information, and we wrote a lot of it down. So this is just the start, the ongoing piece of moving forward. It's discussion, we're taking in what we learned, what we heard, and again, be part of those deeper detailed discussions as we move forward. So won't keep everyone long, but just wanted to say thank you very much to Kelly and Wanda for organizing, and to Cassandra and Chief LaRocca and Heather for coming out. And Jeff is also the portfolio holder for this area. So again, I'm sure he's more than happy to answer any questions you may have too, or Wanda and Kelly. So thank you. Tom, we're going to close up with prayer. I'm going to close up with prayer. Well, then we'll keep it simple, and I'll just say miigwech to all of you. Thank you. Miigwech. Forgot about the draw. Hang on. All right, and the winning ticket is 3654. Last 4 numbers. 3654. Congratulations.